Welcome to Newshour. Britain is expanding its military muscle in what officials describe as the most significant update to the country's deterrent capability in decades. Well, under the AUKUS alliance, the UK has confirmed plans to build 12 nuclear-powered submarines. At the same time, £15 billion has been allocated to develop the A21 Warhead, which will replace the current Holbrooke system on board Trident missiles. Now, this push isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a wider strategic defence review designed to prepare Britain for an era of escalating threats, from conventional state rivals to cyber and electromagnetic warfare. The government also says the submarine programme will support tens of thousands of UK jobs over the coming decade. So, what does this shift mean for the UK's global role, and what trade-offs come with it? Well, joining me in the studio is our very own Ube Shahbanda, who is also a defence analyst with experience in nuclear strategy and maritime security. We'll also speak to Ollie Barrett, our correspondent in London. But first, let's take a look at this story in more detail.
Britain is expanding its underwater arsenal. In a move announced ahead of a major defence review, the UK government has confirmed it will increase the size of its nuclear-powered attack submarine fleet, part of a broader shift toward what officials are calling warfighting readiness. 12 next-generation submarines will be built to replace the current fleet of 7 Astute-class vessels beginning in the late 2030s. Though powered by nuclear reactors, these submarines will carry only conventional weapons. The announcement is a key pillar of the AUKUS partnership, a trilateral security pact between the United Kingdom, the United States and Australia, aimed at maintaining a strategic edge in increasingly contested waters. It comes amid renewed calls for Europe to shoulder more of its own defence burden. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, like other leaders on the continent, is responding to pressure from US President Donald Trump, who has warned that Europe must take greater responsibility for its security. The upcoming Strategic Defence Review will set out how the UK plans to meet that challenge by rearming, retooling and refocusing its forces to respond to modern threats, including cyber, electromagnetic and maritime domains. Separately, the Ministry of Defence has confirmed the cost of Britain's new nuclear warhead programme for the first time. £15 billion will be invested to replace the ageing warheads currently deployed on the UK's Trident armed submarine fleet. Together, these parallel tracks, conventional and nuclear, underline a dual commitment to upgrade Britain's military capabilities and to reaffirm its place as a credible, capable power in a changing world. The submarine programme is expected to be one of the largest industrial undertakings in the UK defence sector, with strategic implications that will stretch across decades. As geopolitical tensions rise, London is choosing to dive deeper, both beneath the surface and into its defence budget.
OK, let's head to London now and get the very latest from our correspondent there. Ollie, what's the latest?
Well, Guy, this is a significant package and a significant shift being set out by the UK government today in terms of the practicalities with regards to what it will mean. Some of the things included in this defence review: 6 new munitions factories in the UK. The Royal Navy will move to what's being described as a more hybrid model with drones, warships, planes and submarines as well. On the topic of submarines, 12 attack submarines will be built as part of the AUKUS partnership between the UK, Australia and the United States. £15 billion being invested in nuclear weapons as well, uplifting of housing and equipment for members of the UK's armed forces. Now, as I say, a significant shift and a significant package being announced by the Prime Minister, who says that the threats facing the UK are now more serious, more immediate and more unpredictable than than at any time, he says, since the Cold War. The threat from Russia, the perceived threat from Russia, is a key part of all of this. Russia mentioned by the Prime Minister in the words that he's been setting out while launching the Strategic Defence Review. The previous Conservative government had a major pivot, it described it as, towards the Indo-Pacific region when it came to its defence policy. I think in this announcement that we're seeing today, you have something of a shift back towards Europe as the focus in this defence review, partly because of the conflict currently unfolding on the continent itself. An interesting part of this is how it's going to be viewed by the United States. Keir Starmer insisting that the UK will get to 2.5% of its GDP being spent on defence by 2027. That is quicker than was previously planned, and saying he is committed and confident that 3% can be delivered by the end of the next Parliament, so around 2030 or so. But the Trump administration has been suggesting that European countries should be committing around 5% of their GDP on defence spending. So how will the White House view this announcement being set out today? That is something that is going to be interesting, with the Washington administration of Donald Trump very clear that it believes that European countries need to do more when it comes to securing their own defence. Another key element to this is the economic side, not just how it's all going to be paid for, and the government says this is a fully funded plan, but the other side of that same equation as well. The government insists that the measures being set out in this Strategic Defence Review will actually create tens of thousands of jobs in the UK, as the UK economy benefits, it believes, from the UK moving to much more of a warlike footing. Guy.
Ollie, thank you very much indeed. Okay, let's dive deeper into this then, no pun intended. Ube, great to have you back in the studio with us. Let's start with this then. 12 new submarines, a new warhead system, some other elements that Ollie mentioned there. What does this tell us about Britain's strategic priorities right now?
Well, with this massive announcement of an expansion of the United Kingdom's strategic nuclear submarines, is this new Labour government trying to put the greats back in Great Britain? But I can tell you that the promises by the Prime Minister Starmer that the United Kingdom will reach a little bit over 3% of their GDP being spent on defence within 9 years, that is not going to be viewed very favorably in Washington, D.C., specifically in the White House. At a time when President Trump, from his first term to his current term, been pressing NATO allies to go beyond 3%, upwards of 5%, a threshold that's already been met by some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics and Poland, who are much closer to the Russian military and to the ongoing war in Ukraine, which I know our viewers have always heard me say this is the largest war in Europe since the Second World War, but it is worth repeating, and that seems to be the impetus here. So what are the practical impacts of this and what will change following this announcement? Well, essentially, the United Kingdom has about 9 strategic attack submarines that include submarines that can launch conventional warheads. That means Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have a range of a little bit over 1,500 kilometers, and nuclear-armed submarines that are able to launch the Trident ICBM, which means they can essentially reach any corner of this Earth with these missiles that have multiple nuclear warheads on them. This is part of the triad nuclear deterrence strategy. In layman's terms, it means you have nuclear-powered submarines, you have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can be launched from the underground, and you have a strategic bomber force. If any one of those forces are destroyed, you will have at least the survivability of these nuclear-powered submarines that can go out into the ocean for almost an indefinite period of time. And that provides the nuclear deterrence, hopefully, to deter a nuclear-powered adversary, Russia, China, from launching their own nuclear attack.
And as you pointed out, Ube, 9 years is a very long time. I mean, President Trump will be pushing 90 at that point. And also, many critics of Starmer accuse him of sort of talking tough, but the reality not matching the rhetoric. If you look at this shopping list, is it too old-fashioned? Is it more about, harping back to the times gone past, nuclear submarines, when we're in a world of AI and drones and high technology?
Well, with the new type of technology and new type of tactics, particularly those that we are witnessing in the war in Ukraine, it means that a military or your Ministry of Defense, regardless of which country, you have to be flexible, you have to adapt to the times. Look, with this new announcement by the United Kingdom, within 9 years, they will have around 20 nuclear-powered submarines, both with the conventional missiles and with the ballistic missiles that can be outfitted with nuclear warheads. The United States has about 71. The Russians have a little bit over 60. The Chinese have about just under that. But it is still very significant because this deal is part of the new United States, Australia, and UK deal, the AUKUS deal. So this will be under that auspices. The US has always been saying, hey, we need to pivot to the Pacific. That is where the potential next great power competition, particularly with China and in the South China Sea, could happen. And with the United Kingdom, its coverage of the globe is part and parcel of this special relationship with the United States, where one goes, we go all.
It's very interesting this. How is AUKUS viewed then in the US? How significant is this? I mean, 3 allies who were already allies. How is the relationship, the alliance reshaping things though?
Look, let's face some of the criticism that Starmer is facing here. Let's sort of break it down. On one hand, yes, this is a major announcement, but when officials in London say the next parliament, that is their way of saying, well, maybe in 9 years, maybe longer. And let's not forget about the ground forces. The UK's armed forces, its ground forces, has shrunk over the years and is around 73,000. And there's been a lot of criticism from Washington that that number needs to be much higher. If you do not control the ground, just because you control the sea and sea lanes, you cannot win a war. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. On one hand, we talk about new tactics with long-range drones, with kamikaze drones working alongside unmanned aircraft and strategic bomber forces. But on the other hand, these tactics from World War II of mass, of bringing in more troops, more armored vehicles, that still has a major impact on the ground. So a big criticism here is that Keir Starmer is not focusing on increasing the number of actual soldiers on the ground. The UK has about 900 soldiers that it rotates into the Baltic areas alongside with France. The next major flashpoint could be very well in the Baltics. If there is ever a ceasefire in Ukraine, there will still be significant tensions in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe. Of course, you've got the American forces in Germany, but the United Kingdom also has a number of commitments as part of its NATO alliance on the ground there. So while on one hand, these nuclear power submarines, they can reach any point across the globe. Look, Russia has been expanding its nuclear-powered submarine force, as well as China, and that is why the United States is looking to the UK to help it man those gaps. Imagine if there is a major conflict in the Taiwan Strait alongside with a major conflict in Eastern Europe or in the North Sea at the same time. Despite that $1 trillion American Pentagon budget, Washington will still need to look to London and France to help it shore up Europe's defense. And that has been a major talking point by President Trump.
And there's domestic benefit too, isn't there, for Keir Starmer? He can go to the shipyards, he can be seen creating jobs. The numbers of potential jobs that are created can be chalked up before really they even come into fruition. There's political benefit here for Keir Starmer back in the UK.
No doubt. As the old American saying goes, all politics is local. And this is where the United States and the United Kingdom are just so similar. You see this in Washington whenever there's a major new project of the new new fifth-generation aircrafts or new attack submarines or warships being built, the numbers of jobs are always highlighted, and they're spread out through multiple states, multiple regions. We're seeing that in the United Kingdom. You always have to keep your constituents happy. Domestic politics means re-election, despite the strategic nature of this decision being made, and that is the nature of democracies.
One of the things that's perpetually discussed is politicians' appetite for war, the extent to which they'd be willing or they'd have the preference to actually go into action. Analysts like yourself have different phrases, ideas. One of the phrases we've heard is warfighting readiness. Another phrase which has come up a lot recently is deterrence through modernisation. What's the difference between those two concepts?
Look, on one hand, Keir Starmer is saying we need to increase our readiness, and that is certainly being welcomed across the NATO military alliance, and particularly in Washington, D.C. And the big criticism of NATO coming from President Trump's administration is that, hey, you've had this massive war on the European continent for over 3 years, and you have not significantly invested in modernizing your ground forces, your strategic deterrence capability, and your Air Force. We want to see something, a new paradigm shift in these NATO capitals. Now, it's one thing to say that you're going to have a nuclear submarine force of around 20 by 2035, perhaps later, but you also have to look at the basics here, the bread and butter, and that is armored vehicles, actual troops, recruiting more troops that can hold ground, and the ability to adapt to Russia's military industrialization and the timeline projection of Russia's ability to reconstitute its armed forces following the Ukraine war, which many military analysts believe to be on an aggressive timeline, and that Keir Starmer's own timeline of by 2035, the next parliament, will not be sufficient to meet that perceived threat. So it is one thing to rhetorically, politically, to say we are investing more in modernization, and to actually do it in the timeline that meets the required threat. It's all about the timeline. If you're behind, then it doesn't matter how advanced your nuclear forces are if you cannot hold actual territorial ground.
And is it credible to preach restraint whilst at the same time rearming? I mean, this decades-old game of using advanced nuclear capability but only as a deterrent, is that game still working? Has it changed at all? I mean, you've been following these events for decades. Is it possible to say, we don't want a war, we're not planning to use it, but by the way, we have got nuclear weapons? It's
that Cold War tango between nuclear-powered countries that remains very much active today in a post-Cold War era, perhaps a neo-Cold War era with the war in Ukraine. Look, Russia has been advancing its nuclear warhead stockpiles and its intercontinental ballistic missiles. China is now perhaps on parity with Russia after being behind for the past few decades. And so that leads to a cascading effect where no country wants to be left behind. It's a very small club of not only nuclear-armed countries, but nuclear-armed countries that have the ability to deploy nuclear-powered submarines that are very, very difficult to detect, that have the ability to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. Each one of those missiles can take out a major city. So even with Great Britain's fleet of around 20 in the future, just having 2 of them can pose a major threat to any adversary around the world. So it's one of those things where you don't want, it's a perception, right? It's about also not only deterrence, but sending a message. At the same time, while you have mutually assured destruction, and at least for the time being, preventing any major nuclear power country from launching an attack that would lead to destruction of its own civilization, that is not preventing conventional warfare from taking place like what we're seeing in Ukraine today. And that is an adjustment that NATO military allies have to take. It's one thing to advance your nuclear strategic capabilities, but if you're still not able to deter a major adversarial power, and let's not forget, NATO is essentially formed to deter and counter the former Soviet Union and now Russia, but if you're still not succeeding in deterring your adversary, well, you also have to question, are we doing enough in other aspects of our military forces? When we talk about modernization, but we're not looking at the very basics of ensuring high morale and readiness at the troop level. And that is going to be a major question. Look, $15 billion pounds, that's a rounding error, for the Pentagon. So you can certainly expect the Trump administration to send a message to Keir Starmer, thank you, but we want to see more.
Let's go into some of that detail now and just explain, help us understand, Ubay, the specifics of some of this capability. So the Astrea A21, that's being pitched as a direct replacement for Holbrook. What do we know about its capabilities and its fit with the Trident system?
Well, you're going to have a new class of nuclear submarines called the Dreadnought class that will come into play around 2030. So, look, you have to understand that the current most advanced missile capability, ballistic missiles, and the most advanced attack submarines that the United Kingdom and the United States have were designed from the previous decade, because it takes so long for the designs and building these complex weapon systems, these submarines. So you have to build them at least with a decade, sometimes 2 decades in advance, just the concepts. So it will mean that you have more, their ability to survive an ongoing attack, their ability to also function, not to malfunction. So you need to advance these, also the electronic capabilities of these strategic nuclear-powered submarines, because they could potentially, in a case of war, be out to sea for months on end.
Let's talk about some of the other elements now. Now, as Ollie mentioned, there is also a cyber component to this package, electromagnetic command as well. Just demystify this, some of us, Ubay. Tell us about that capability and how it is deployed.
Look, sensors will be the major deciding factor in modern warfare. For example, look at what the ongoing war in Ukraine. If you're able to jam a cruise missile, if you're able to blind your opponent, whether it's in the air, on the ground, or at sea, it doesn't matter how advanced their weapon system are. So it's a matter of being able to see your enemy and adversary and detect them before they detect you. And that has been, again, a classic component of military strategy that is still very much active today. A nuclear-powered submarine is only as good as its ability to not be detected. Otherwise, it's completely useless.
And going back to President Trump's call for European countries to make a much bigger contribution, percentage of their GDP, to defend themselves, the UK then inching towards 2.5% of GDP, it's not enough, is it?
Frankly, it is not. Frankly, it is not. Look, the United Kingdom does have a very capable armed forces, a very powerful navy. Traditionally, the United Kingdom's ability to project power across the globe has been connected and anchored with its naval power. But even, there are critics saying that even with over 20 warships within 9 years, that may not be sufficient given the production capability of China. And even with Russia having its entire armed forces in Ukraine, facing sanctions, essentially retooling its manufacturing base to produce more weapons, the Russians are still advancing there and reconstituting their naval forces. And they may be able to do it faster than the United Kingdom. And so that is a major criticism that Keir Starmer is facing, that he is not doing enough, given what the Russians are planning in terms of producing with their own nuclear-powered submarine force.
And finally, Ubay, as an analyst, someone that looks at these strategies, we've heard the plans outlined, the nuclear capability, the submarines, the electromagnetic component, the cyber component. Where are the gaps, though? Where is this strategy, perhaps, where does it have perhaps a blind spot?
Look, the United Kingdom is very good at cyber, at GHQ, and it's comparable as the National Security Agency, the NSA, in the United States. That is a powerful capability and almost an equalizer for the United Kingdom, where you're able to penetrate the systems and the communications of your enemy. That allows you a bird's eye view of where your adversary is deploying its ground forces, its strategic air bomb command, and its nuclear submarines. But the major deficit here, and I go back to this, are the ground forces. Only not even 100,000, soldiers, and with a major deficit in armored vehicles. Looking at the fact that Russia has been able to lose tens of thousands of armored vehicles in the war in Ukraine, but they are reconstituting that force, and they are projected to essentially be able to reconstitute most of those losses within perhaps 5 years. And that is something that the United Kingdom will really needs to confront if they're going to be facing a major peer-to-peer or power versus another great power war that could very well happen not only in the Pacific but also on the European continent. Now, traditionally, the thought in London and Paris is, well, the American cavalry will come to save us. But that may not always be the case, given the signals that we're seeing from the President Trump's administration telling European countries, even though the UK has Brexit, hey, this is your war, and if you want us to back you, you have to do more to defend your own continent. Certainly, Keir Starmer's announcement of expanding its nuclear power forces is a response as part of that, from that impetus of President Trump's policy. But will it be enough if another major war on the European continent or in the Pacific takes place before that 9-year timetable? And that is where I have to side with the criticism here that it could very well not be enough. 3% in 9 years. Look at Poland, look at the Baltic states. Keir Starmer may have to delve back and make some very difficult political decisions to spend more.
Very interesting indeed. The UK perhaps not viewed like Poland as the model ally at the moment. Ube, we thank you as always for your analysis, and we wish you safe travels back to Washington DC. Ube Sharbanda there with us in the studio. Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of NewsHour. The UK's defence ambitions are growing, but so too are the questions about cost, capability and credibility. As Britain builds for the future, the world will be watching above and below the waves. From all of us here at AnewZ, thanks for being with us.